Okay, this is Witch of Blackbird Pond, chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2. It took 9 days for the dolphin to make the 43-mile voyage from Saybrook to Weathersfeld. As though the ship were bewitched from the moment they left Saybrook, everything went wrong. With the narrowing of the river, the fresh sea breeze dropped behind, and by sunset it died away altogether. The sails sagged, limp and soundless, and the dolphin rolled sickeningly in midstream. On one or two evenings, a temporary breeze raised their hopes and sent the ship ahead a few miles, only to die away again. In the morning, Kit could scarcely tell that they had moved. The dense brown forest on either side never seemed to vary, and ahead there was only a new bend in the river to tantalize her. How can you stand it? She fumed to a red-headed sailor who was taking advantage of the windless hours to give the carved dolphin at the prow a fresh coat of paint. Doesn't the wind ever blow on this river? Mighty seldom, ma'am, he responded with indifferent good humor. You get used to it. We'll spend most of the summer waiting for a breeze, going or coming. How often do you go up this river? Every few weeks. We make a run, say to Boston or New Orleans. Oh, sorry, guys, I missed my page. To Boston or New Orleans, fill up the hold, and then back to Hartford. She could see why Mistress Eaton chose to stay at home in Saybrook. Does it always take this long? Call this long, the sailor replied, swinging far out to daub the curving tail of the dolphin. Why, ma'am, I've known it to take as many days to get from here to Hartford as to go all the way to Jamaica. But P.M. in no hurry. The dolphin's home to me, and I'm satisfied, wind or no wind. Kit was ready to fly to pieces with frustration. How could she eke out the patience that had been scarcely enough to see her through a few remaining hours? And how could she force herself to endure another meal at the same board with Goodwife Cruff and her cowed shadow of a husband? Never a civil word had been spoken by either one of them. Plainly, they considered the becalmed ship all her doing. And it spoiled her appetite just to watch that miserable little wraith of a child, Prudence, not even allowed to sit at board with them, but kept behind her mother, where she had to eat standing up in the stingy portion they handed back to her. Once or twice she had seen the father furtively slip the child an extra morsel from his plate, but he was plainly too spineless to stand up for her against his shrew of a wife. A more unpromising child she had never seen, Kit thought, yet she couldn't get Prudence out of her mind. There was some spark in her in that small frame that refused to be quenched. Late one afternoon, Kit had come upon the little girl standing alone by the rail, and seeing the child's wistful, adoring gaze, had moved closer. As they stood side by side, a crane rose slowly from the beach, with a graceful lift of its great wings, and they followed its flight, a leisurely line of white against the dark trees. The child had gasped, tilting back her head, her peaked little face aglow with wonder and delight. But in that instant, a harsh call from the hatchway sent her scurrying. With a pang, Kit realized that not once since they had boarded the ship had she glimpsed the wooden doll. Had her own rash performance only served to cheat the child of the one toy she possessed? They were certainly not good at forgetting, these New Englanders. Captain Eaton treated her with punctilious caution. Nate remained aloof, absorbed in a totally male world of rigging and canvas. On such a small ship, it was remarkable how he managed to avoid her. The few times she happened to be directly in his path, he tossed her an indifferent grin, and his quizzical blue eyes flicked past and dismissed her. If it weren't for John Holbrook, I couldn't bear it, she thought. He's the only one on the ship who doesn't seem to begrudge my existence. He doesn't mind the delay either. I believe he's actually gate fit for it. She looked with envy at where he sat, propped against a bulkhead, lost in a bulky brown volume. What could there be in those books of his? There he sat, hour after hour, so intent that often his lips moved, and two spots of color burned in his pale cheeks, as though some secret excitement sprang from his pages. Sometimes he forgot meals entirely. Only when he had wrung the last dregs of light from the sunset and the shadows reached across the water and fell upon his book would he reluctantly raise his head and become aware of the ship again. When that moment came, Kit made sure that his eyes, blinking half blindly from his book, would focus on her gay, silk-clad figure nearby. John would smile, mark his place with deliberation, and come to join her. In the soft half-darkness, his stiff manners gradually relaxed into a boyish eagerness. Slowly, Kit pieced together the details of what seemed to be an appalling, dull history. I suppose it was foolish for a tanner's son even to think about Harvard, John told her. It was 6 miles to the school, and my father never could spare me for more than a month or so out of the year. He wanted me to learn, though. He never minded how long I burned the candles at night. You mean you worked all day and studied at night? Was it worth it? Of course it was worth it, he answered, surprised at her question. I was set on college. I finished all the requirements in Latin. I know the accidents almost by heart. But you're not going to Harvard? She shook his head. He shook his head. Up until the spring, I kept hoping I could save money enough. I had planned to walk over the foot trails through Connecticut and across Massachusetts. Well, the Lord didn't see fit to provide the money, but now he has opened another way for me. Reverend Bulkley of Wethersfield had agreed to take me as a pupil. He is a very famous scholar in medicine as well as theology. I couldn't have found a more learned teacher, even at Harvard. Such frank talk about money embarrassed Kit. Her grandfather had seldom mentioned such a thing. She herself had rarely so much as held a coin in her hand, and for 16 years she had never questioned the costly and beautiful things that surrounded her. In the last few months, to be sure, she had a terrifying glimpse of what it might mean to live without money, but it seemed shameful to speak of it. Instead, she tried to tell him of her own childhood, and it was as though they each spoke a totally different language. She saw that John was scandalized at the way she had grown up on the island, running free as the wind in a world filled with sunshine, with the green palms, the warm turquoise ocean rolling into the white beaches meant nothing to him. Didn't her parents give her work to do? He insisted. I don't remember my parents at all, she told him. My father was born on the island and was sent to England to school. He met my mother there and brought her back to Barbados with him. They had only 3 years together. They were both drowned on a pleasure trip to Antigua, and grandfather and I were left alone. Were there no women to care for you? Oh, slaves, of course. I had a black nursemaid, but I never needed anyone but grandfather. He was There were no words to explain grandfather. In the twilight, the memory of him was very sharp. The soft pink skin aging on his fine cheekbones, the thin aristocratic nose, the eyes so shrewd and yet so loving. She dared not to trust her voice. It must have been hard to lose him, said John gently. I am so glad you have an aunt to come to. She was my mother's only sister, said Kit, the tight pain easing a little. Grandfather says my mother talked about her the livelong day and never got over being homesick for her. Her name is Rachel, and she was charming and gay, and they said she could have had her pick of any man in her father's regiment. But instead, she fell in love with a Puritan and ran away to America without her father's blessing. She wrote to my mother from Wethersfield, and she has written a letter to me every year of my life. She's going to be very happy to see you. I've tried so hard to imagine Aunt Rachel, mused Kit. Grandfather said that my mother was thin and plain like me, but Aunt Rachel was beautiful. Her hair and eyes will be dark, I suppose, like mine. But what will her voice be like? My mother remembered that she was always laughing. John Holbrook looked earnestly at the girl beside him. That was a great many years ago, he reminded her. Don't forget your aunt has been far away from England for a long time. Kit was aware again of that intangible warning that she could not interpret. Every day of this delay made it harder for her to shake her uneasiness. On the seventh morning, Captain Eaton resorted to a curious device which John Holbrook called walling up the river. Two sailors in a small boat went some distance ahead, bearing a long rope fastened to a small anchor. Rowing as far as the rope would stretch, they dropped the anchor. On the deck of the ship, the crew lined up, 10 hardy men barred to the waist, each grasping the rope, and began a rhythmical march from one end of the ship to the other. As one man reached the end, he dropped the rope and raced back to grab it again at the end of the line. Painfully, almost imperceptibly, the Dolphin inched forward through the water. In an hour's time, they had reached the anchor, and the rowboat went ahead a second time. Over and over, hour after hour, the men moved, hauling the ship by the sheer force of straining muscle and gasping breath. Sweat poured down their arms and shoulders. The agonizing slowness was harder to endure than no mention at all. Kit shrugged away from the sight of those lunging bodies. A hot spring sun beat down without relief. She twitched her own shoulders fretfully under the silk that stuck clammily against her skin. And the heat of the stench of horses steamed up from the depths of the hold as though the animals were still there. This morning, the cook had refused to spare her enough water, even for a decent bath. It was almost too much to bear when she heard a splash directly below her and saw that Nate and two of the other young men had taken advantage of a wait for the rowboat and were thrashing about like porpoises in the water. Nate looked up and caught her wistful eye. Jump in, why don't you? He taunted. You warned me not to never do it again, Kit replied incautiously. Do you need an excuse? I'll shout for help and go under. You couldn't just stand there and watch me drown, could you? Yes, I could, Kit laughed in spite of herself. And I would, too. Then you can stay there and frizzle, responded Nate. As he paddled toward the ladder, Kit watched him with both envy and relief. He had sounded as friendly and easy as on that first morning in Saybrook Harbor. As though to prove the constraint between them was broken the next wait for the rowboat, Nate strolled over to join her where she stood watching. I'll wager you're wishing you'd never left the Barbados, he said. 'Twas unfair of me to tease you. How I envied you, she exclaimed, to get into that water and away from this filthy ship, even for a moment. In a split second, a squall darkened Nate's blue eyes. Filthy? The Dolphin? Oh, she laughed impatiently. I know you're forever scrubbing, but that stable smell, I'll never get it out of my hair as long as I live. Nate's indignation found vent in scorn. Maybe you think it would smell prettier with the hold full of human bodies, half of them rotting in their chains before anyone knew they were dead. Kit recoiled as much from his angry tone as from the repulsive words. What are you talking about? People down in the holes? I suppose you never knew about slaves on Barbados? Of course I know. I knew. We used to own more than 100. How else could you work a plantation? How did you think they got there? Did you fancy they traveled from Africa in private cabins like yours? She had never thought about it at all. But you don't have slaves in America? Yes, to our shame, mostly down Virginia way, but there are plenty of fine folk like you here in New England who will pay a fat price for a black flesh without asking any questions how it got here. If my father would consent to bring back just one load of slaves, we would have had our new catch by this summer. But we Eatons were almighty proud that our ship has a good, honest stink of horses. Nate was gone again. What a touchy temper he had. She hadn't meant to insult his precious ship. Why did he deliberately turn everything to her disadvantage? He had been just on the point of making friends. Now the trip would probably be over before she could speak to him again. And why should she care? A rude, freckle-faced sailor who took more notice of a strip of canvas than a brocaded gown? At least John Holbrook knew how to speak with respect. But even John Holbrook did not approve of her completely. She was forever astonishing him. Last night, for instance, she had reached impulsivity for the volume he held, opened it at the marked page, and squinting curiously at the words in the wan light, had read aloud. We are in the first place to apprehend that there is a time fixed and stated by God for the devil to enjoy a dominion over our sinful and therefore woeful world. Toward the end of his rhyme, the descent of the devil and wrath upon the world will produce more woeful effects than what have been in former ages. The death pangs of the devil will make him to be more of a devil than he ever was. Goodness, Kit wrinkled up her nose. Is this what you read all day long? She looked up to find John staring at her. You can read that? He questions, with the same amusement he had shown when she had proven she could swim. How did you learn to read when you say you just ran wild like a savage and never did any work? Do you call reading work? I don't even remember how I learned. When it was too hot to play, Grandfather would take me into his library where it was dark and cool and read to me out loud from his books. And later, I would sit beside him and read to myself while he studied. What sort of books? John's voice was incredulous. Oh, history and poetry and plays. Plays? Yes, the plays were the best. Wonderful ones by Dryden and Shakespeare and Otway. Your grandfather allowed a girl to read such things? They were beautiful, those plays. Have you never read them? John's pale cheeks reddened. There are no such books in Saybrook. In Boston, perhaps, but the proper use of reading is to improve our sinful nature and to fill our minds with God's holy word. Kit stared at him. She pictured Grandfather, the blue-veined hands caressing the leather bindings, and she knew that he had not cherished his books with any thought of improving his sinful nature. She could imagine the twinkle that would have danced in his eyes at those solemn words. All the same, the reproof in John Holbrook's voice left her discomforted. Somehow, she felt that John was always drawing back, uneasy at this friendship that was growing between them, and she herself was often repelled by the hard uprightness that lay just under his gentle voice and looks. She saw now that she could not tell him about the books that she had loved any more than she could make him see the palm trees swaying under a brilliant blue sky. Early the next morning, a country breeze came whistling along the river. The dolphin sprang to life, scudded the last few miles, and bumped against the wharf at Wethersfield Landing. The shore, muffled in thick scarves of drifting mist, looked scarcely different from the miles of unbroken forest that they had seen for the past week. Sailors began vigorously to roll out the great casks of molasses and pile them along the wharf. Two of the men lowered over the side the 7 smaller leather. Her heart sank. This was Wethersfield, just a narrow sandy stretch of shoreline, a few piles sunk in the river with rough planking for a platform. Out of the mist jutted a row of cavernous wooden structures that must be warehouses, and beyond that the dense dripping green of field and woods. No town, not a house, only a few men and boys and 2 yapping dogs who had come to meet the boat. With something like panic, Kit watched Goodwife Cruff descend the ladder and stride ahead of her husband along the wharf. Prudence, dragging at her mother's hand, gazed back imploringly as they passed. Ma, she ventured timidly, the pretty lady got, here at Weathersfeld. On here, I think she means on here. Kit summoned the boldness to speak to her. Yes, Prudence, she called clearly, and I hope that I will see you often. No, she got off here. That's supposed to say off. Goodwife Cruff halted and glared at Kit. I'll thank you, let my child alone, she spat out. We do not welcome strangers in this town, and you be the kind we like least. Jerking Prudence nearly off her feet, she marched firmly up the dirt road and disappeared in the fog. Even John Holbrook's farewells were abstracted. A formal bow, a polite wish for her pleasant arrival, and he too strode eagerly into the fog in quest of his new teacher. Then Kit saw Captain Eaton approaching and knew that the moment had come when the truth would have to be told. There must be some kind of mistake, the captain began. We signaled yesterday that we would reach Weathersfield at dawn. I expected that your aunt and uncle would be here to meet you, no matter how early it may be. Kit swallowed, gathered her courage. Captain Eaton, she said boldly, my uncle and aunt can hardly be blamed for not meeting me. You see, well, to be honest, they do not even know I am coming. The captain's jaw tightened. You gave me to understand that they had sent for you to come. Kit lifted her head proudly. I told you that they wanted me, she corrected him. Mistress Wood is my mother's sister. Naturally, she would always want me to come. Even assuming that to be true, how could you be sure that they were still in Connecticut? My Aunt Rachel's letter only came 6 months ago. He scowled with annoyance. You know very well that I should never have taken you on board, and had I known this, now I shall have to take the time to find where your uncle lives and deliver you. But understand, I take no responsibility for your coming. Kit's head went higher. I am entirely responsible for my own coming, she assured him haughtily. Fair enough, the captain responded grimly. Look here, Nate, he turned back. See if 2 hands can be spared to carry this baggage. Kit's cheeks went scarlet. Why should Nate, who had carefully been somewhere else during the whole of the last 9 days, have to be so handy at just this moment? Now, whatever befell, he was going to be there to witness it. With those mocking blue eyes, it had maddening cool amusement. What of Aunt Rachel? But there was no time for doubt now. Between trying to hold up her head confidently and at the same time find a place to set down her daintily kid shoes between the slimy ruts and the mud puddles, Kit had all she could tend to.